Greetings, fellow moviegoers, and welcome to Movie Central, the place to talk about movies, TV shows based on movies, toys based on movies, games based on movies, and rides based on movies. I'm your host, Mr. CCS, and these are my pets, George the Gorilla, Call the Dolphin, and Frank the Sea Turtle. Guys, I don't want to do this. Ever since the beginning of the season, I would fear that I'd need to review this movie, and now the day has finally come. 7 years after its release, I finally watched what is said to be one of the worst modern movies of all time. And now, it's my task to review the movie and tell you if it isn't as bad as people think it is. I'm not gonna lie, this is gonna be difficult. But before we start, let's get some history out of the way. The Mummy in film has always been weird. The original 1932 Boris Karloff film was well received by critics when released, but what was surprising to me is that there weren't any sequels to it. They were more like spiritual successors. The Mummy was no longer Boris Karloff's Imhotep, but rather a new character called Karis, who was played by Lon Chaney Jr. in the first film, who later played the Wolfman, of course, and Tom Tyler. This would also be the character that Christopher Lee played in the Hammer film's monster movies. Since I brought them up here, I might as well talk about those. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the British production company created their own versions of the films from Universal, which included the likes of Frankenstein, The Mummy, and Dracula. Very high-profile actors would appear in these movies, such as Michael Gough, who is best known for playing Alfred in the Tim Burton/Joel Schumacher Batman movies, David Prowse, whose physicality was seen in films like A Clockwork Orange and the original Star Wars trilogy, and Sir Christopher Lee, who prominently was known for playing villains, most commonly seen as Dracula. I don't know why Hammer fizzled out of popularity, but it's probably because of their bigger budget films back in the United States. Anyways, by the 1990s, The Mummy returned to the big screen with the smash hit remake in 1999, which I, of course, talked about, and which had 2 sequels, with the franchise making over $1 billion at the box office. Unfortunately, the negative reviews that the third film received basically killed the franchise. I have explained why that negativity doesn't really make sense, because despite the awful script, the movie is still pretty entertaining at the end of the day. That, however, is beyond the point. The real point I'm trying to get to is as follows. Universal still wanted to reboot their classic monsters, and they tried that several times throughout the 2000s decade, and that carried over into the 2010s. I've talked about Van Helsing, The Wolfman, and Dracula Untold, and all of those movies turned out to be disasters for critics, 2 deserved and 1 not. But they were still going to try, and the franchise they looked to was The Mummy. This time, instead of a fun, energetic action flick, they were going to try and stick closer to the original movie's tone, with modern scares, and honestly, this original idea that they were sticking to seems pretty cool. The new redesign of the titular monster was pretty good, with bluish dead skin and a physical prowess to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, this was around the time when 20th Century Fox was working on X-Men Apocalypse, where the blue-skinned villain would have been introduced in the prologue scene set in ancient Egypt, and Universal would have been accused of stealing that idea. So instead, they went in an entirely different direction, creating a female mummy to serve as the antagonist of the film. Unfortunately, the idea of rushing into world building got to the head of the studio, and they decided to tease as many monsters as possible with the film. And the overall plan to reboot The Wolfman, The Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, and a few others, a planned overarching narrative would most likely have been going up against Dracula. May or may not have been played by Luke Evans, but considering the fact that Dracula Untold was poorly received, I think they would have recast him. By 2016, Tom Cruise, one of America's biggest action stars, was cast in the movie, and with him was Christopher McQuarrie, to write the script and story, who worked on the later Mission Impossible movies, the last 4 to be exact. Unfortunately, due to meddling by the actor, the original script was heavily reworked to make it the Tom Cruise and the Monsters franchise, which was detrimental to the overall movie and the future films that are never going to happen now. With that said, the movie was dropped into theaters during the summer of 2017, and it tanked. Critics thrashed this movie to shreds, with Rotten Tomatoes consensus reading as follows. Lacking the campy fun of the franchise's most recent entries and failing to deliver many monster movie thrills, The Mummy suggests a speedy unraveling for the dark universe. Honestly, this pretty dull and lifeless movie deserved that kind of treatment,
as well as plans for what the Dark Universe would have been, were scrapped until 2025, when the Dark Universe will be reborn as a new themed land at Universal's Epic Universe, which will be a massive sight to behold. However, what are my thoughts on the original attempt made for the big screen?
As you can probably tell, I'm not enthusiastic about it whatsoever. But nevertheless, I still have a job to do. So, with that said, let's take a look at the 2017 action horror flick, The Mummy.
Nick Morton, played by Tom Cruise, is a soldier of fortune who plunders ancient sites for timeless artifacts and sells them to the highest bidder. Oh great, he's Indiana Jones. When Nick and his partner, played by Jake Johnson, come under attack in the Middle East, the ensuing battle accidentally unearths Amenet, played by Sofia Boutella, a betrayed Egyptian princess who is entombed under the desert for thousands of years. With her powers constantly evolving, Morton must now stop the resurrected monster as she embarks on a furious rampage through the streets of London.
Now, I went into this with super low expectations, as well as a fear that this may also be on my list of no pointers, which are the movies that I've given a score of 0 out of 10. My fears were proven correct, as this is officially on my list of no pointers. Good God, this was absolutely terrible and downright insulting to watch. It has no stakes, horrendous acting, and by far some of the worst VFX I have seen in a modern movie. You can clearly tell that there was no passion put into creating this new world, which should have been a no frickin' brainer. At least with regards to Van Helsing or Dracula Untold, the passion is obviously there, and the world has some promise. This world was only set up for more movies, and it's so obvious. As you can tell, I hated this movie, and there's nothing that redeems it whatsoever. So, I'm just going to go deeper into my thoughts and explain how this is an insulting, messy, unfunny ripoff that calls itself a feature film.
So, what did I think of Tom Cruise's performance? Normally, I've actually been pretty fond of the guy. I'm a big fan of Ethan Hunt, having watched all of the Mission Impossible films, which yes, I plan on covering, and even really enjoy the Top Gun movies, which are just pure fun. I'm impressed with a lot of the stuff he's done in his career, and that novelty will never wear off as long as he continues to act. Having said all of that, he was completely miscast. I don't mind having an action hero type lead, but the script does him no favors, with or without the rewrites he implemented. There's no tension in regards to whether he'll live or die, because he's basically a god. In stark contrast, I was far more worried for him as Pete Maverick Mitchell in the mountain sequence of Top Gun Maverick. I genuinely thought he was going to die, because the movie makes it clear he is a capable human being, but even he has his limits. Even Ethan Hunt in the finale of Mission Impossible Fallout was close to death. In this film, however, Nick Morton is invincible, and I felt nothing for him when he was in any inch of danger, because I knew he'd get out of it unscathed. Even then, Rick O'Connell was someone I knew would get out unscathed, and he went through actual danger that freaked me out in all 3 of his movies. So what's this new guy's excuse? Also, they try to make him do banterful dialogue, and it just feels so forced. When Fraser did it as Rick O'Connell, it felt natural and witty, because it was well written. Hell, even Hugh Jackman as Van Helsing had better banter with Carl in that piece of garbage than Morton in this piece of garbage. TLDR, get Stephen Sommers to give his guidance on any future Mummy films. Moving on to the other characters, this is where the ripoff aspect comes into play. Because Corporal Vale is just that, a ripoff. A ripoff of what exactly? Jack, from An American Werewolf in London. I'm not kidding! They used that concept for this movie and it wasn't nearly as funny, nor as clever. It doesn't help that Jake Johnson looks completely artificial with that zombie makeover. When they did it back in the 1980s with Jack, he looked gnarly and gross, and he constantly got more rotten as the film went on. Here, there's barely, if any, changes to the design, and that is criminal. Also, Jake Johnson would have played a much better lead. He's in need of a role that he can make his own, rather than giving it to an actor that is experienced and seasoned with this type of character. Thank heavens the Spider-Verse team got him for those two actually amazing movies. Moving on to the love interest character, Jenny is all over the place. Annabelle Wallis, the actress who played her, seems like she can act, but this movie didn't show it at all. For one thing, she's completely one note the entire movie, and she does that weird thing switching between accents that Hugh Jackman did in Van Helsing. And that made even less sense here than it does in that film. Pick one direction, movie, one or the other. And then there's Russell Crowe, who plays a modernized version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. That was a mistake. Russell Crowe can give a good performance when he has a good script. But this was such a waste of talent. I honestly feel sorry for the guy because I know he's a good actor, and this movie made him look bad. Jekyll and Hyde are only in the plot just to add more monster characters in the movie, and that is painfully obvious. Watch it. Moving on, because I'm getting more frustrated as I think about it. Finally, we have our villain, Amenet. Imhotep, she is not. God damn it, this was a terrible replacement. First things first, her backstory is extremely convoluted. I can buy her wanting to rule her father's kingdom. I can buy her killing her family to do so. I cannot buy her using a cursed dagger to kill her family because that makes her automatically powerful and lacking a good arc. In Imhotep's case, he wanted to live with Menaksunamun, resurrecting her after she died. But once he was discovered, he was forced to endure an ancient curse that would give him the power to summon the plagues of Egypt if he were ever awoken. Making her evil from the get-go makes her less intriguing as a villain. Also, they make her sympathetic despite the fact that she wants to kill millions of people. At least Imhotep had a reason that we saw. With her, we don't see a relationship with her loved one. We just know it exists. Overall, Amenet is a very disinteresting villain, and one of the least interesting villains I've ever seen in anything. I'd rather watch Arnold making ice puns for an eternity, because that is, at the very least, interesting. Moving on to the effects, hot damn they are terrible. First things first, the mummy herself has a very boring design that doesn't look too rotten. Imhotep's undead appearance was freaky and gross, and every time he regenerated, he looked more human, but there was still this undead nature to him. With her, all I see is a bad makeup-covered woman with chunks of her body removed with CGI. Also, do you remember when Imhotep would kill a victim? When we saw the aftermath, their bodies were shriveled up and dry like they had absolutely nothing left in them. Here, they look like prototype zombie designs that are knockoffs of the infected from The Last of Us. And while I thought it was a cool idea for her to use them as her soldiers of the dead, the execution is enough to put that good idea to crap. And that freaking sucks. Also, the plane sequence is too CGI heavy. And Tom Cruise has actually done real plane stunts with Top Gun and Mission Impossible Fallout, where he actually did a halo jump. Hell, in 2012 we got the opening scene of The Dark Knight Rises, where Bane has that whole plane heist, and that was all done on camera practically. 5 years later we get this horrible green screen version, which isn't even close to good. I've already talked about the CGI they used on Jake Johnson, but I still need to mention how truly awful it looks. You could have done this practically and you screwed it up. Well done! Moving on to the music, it was composed by Brian Tyler, who is a man I've come to respect recently, because of the scores of his that I do really like, which includes the cool hip side of the Fast and Furious films, and the cutesy fantasy side of the Super Mario Bros. Movie. I've also come to appreciate his scores from the MCU a bit too. However, this was a painfully generic soundtrack, and if I had heard it anywhere without context, I couldn't tell you where it was from, and that is an insult to the work of this guy, because I have a lot of respect for him. Finally, we have the tone and action, and I would also like to express more of my ripoff comment from earlier. First off, the use of ravens is straight out of Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, which brilliantly used the crow's things to scare the crap out of the characters, and me, for someone who's afraid of birds, back in 1963. 54 years later, and we get the CGI variation of that, and it sucks. The opening action sequence also feels like a ripoff of both Black Hawk Down and the James Bond films, specifically Skyfall, which makes you want to watch both of those movies more than you want to watch this. That scene where they find the tomb is eerily similar to the scene in the 2016 Suicide Squad movie, where June Moon finds the tomb of the Enchantress, and I'd rather watch that than this any day. The plane scene feels like a knockoff of the Dark Knight Rises plane scene, but also the plane portion of Uncharted 3, which would later be adapted into the movie, which did this whole thing way better. Hell, Rampage, which came out the next freaking year, did this scene much better, and that was a video game adaptation. Finally, that scene in the headquarters felt like a knockoff of Batman v Superman, with monsters like Dracula, the creature from the Black Lagoon, and Frankenstein's monster being teased, which is eerily similar to Lex Luthor's files on the Justice League from Batman vs Superman. Also, why is the Book of the Living in this movie? Are you trying to deliberately piss fans of the original movie off? Because it's working in my case. Finally, the final battle felt like a knockoff of Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy, and the ending felt like the ending of Van Helsing, where the two characters ride off into the sunset in the desert to find more monsters. Were these writers just on a movie craze one weekend? Also, this movie tries to be dark, and when it does, it's dull and lifeless. And when it tries to be funny, the joke is either a character going, "I don't do that," the character doing said action, and then saying, "You're right, I definitely do that." Or it's just not funny and mainly cringy. You know what? I can't take it anymore. The Mummy is one of the worst films I've ever seen. It's dull, boring, unfunny, and is a straight-up ripoff. How could such an interesting concept go to such low levels? Studio interference? Actor interference? Whatever the case may be, I'm downright happy that this movie, and whatever the hell this franchise this would have been, is dead and buried where it belongs. Because if this movie was any indicator of what could have been, then we were in for a very, very rough ride. Just for all of that, I give this movie no points at all. It deserves nothing from me. All it deserves is my lowest form of anger and despair towards a movie, and that is a 0 out of 10. Universal, you should be absolutely ashamed of yourselves for letting this get out of hand.
Well, I'm glad that's over with. However long I've kept you hostage, thanks for sticking with me. Next week, I guarantee you that the movie is nowhere near as terrible as this. However, I'm gonna need time to recalibrate and try to think of my life's choices. With that said, my name is Mr. CCS, these are my pets, this is Movie Central, and that, my friends, is Rob. See you next week, and pray for all four of us.